Hello and welcome to another episode of the Self-Made Podcast. On this episode of the show, we're going to do another solo show, this time deeping into all things hypertrophy. One of the main common things our clients come to us for is wanting to build muscle. They want to build their chest, they want to build their arms, they want to build their back. But a lot of people struggle with knowing where to start and feel lost in, do I need to get leaner first? Do I need to get bigger? What even is hypertrophy? What should I do in my training? Should I lift as heavy as possible or should I train more for a pump? And this is what this episode is going to break down in depth. We're going to go through what is hypertrophy, understanding all the intricate elements of it so you know why you're doing things in your program. We're going to talk nutrition for hypertrophy. What are the things that you need to know and what are the things that you can ignore and are irrelevant in the big picture? And we're going to go through planning your hypertrophy cycle. What things do you need to consider when putting a program in place and what we do to help clients all over the world with this exact goal. I also want to just quickly jump on this intro to talk about the future of this self-made podcast. As you probably know, this is my absolute pride and joy and something that I want to do a lot more for you guys. And because of that, we're going to try and expand this, not just the great quality interviews and solo shows that we do. I want to be able to get a regular host of characters where you know what you're getting on certain topics. So I want to hear from you. So what do you want this podcast to discuss? Obviously, at the moment, the main aim is health and fitness and business, but we want to talk to you about other things. We've spoken about films, we've spoken about rugby, we've spoken about pro wrestling on this show. What is it that you want to hear more of? And I am going to go and try and find experts and people in the field that are going to come on regularly to talk about certain things. Do you want us to break down rugby matches every time there's a big show on? Do you want us to talk about pro wrestling or big film releases as well as health and fitness? Or is this something that doesn't interest you? So find me on social media at Kingsley Dutton and let me know what you want to see more of. But I will leave you with the episode going all over hypertrophy. One of the most common goals every single guy wants to achieve. In your 20s, it's about looking as big as possible, attracting the opposite sex and walking into a room with a bit of power and charisma. In your 30s and 40s, it becomes standing out at work, being able to run around with your kids, lift things, move things around and be able to perform at your best. Whatever your reason for growing muscle, it is the most common goal. And looking at research now in terms of longevity, a really important goal to improve our health as we age. So in this episode of the show, we are going to talk all things hypertrophy, our take on it, what is it, nutritional considerations for it, and help you get started on that muscle building goal. This is a great time to start thinking about building muscle. You probably listen to this now, going into the summer as this is recorded, are probably either coming back or about to go on your summer holidays. You have probably gone through your dieting phase and gotten yourself in fantastic shape for the beach. We're now coming into the winter where we may be covering up in a little bit more layers, which sounds really weird considering it is the hottest time of the year and the hottest UK summer on record, I think, at this moment in time. But that time will come where it gets cold and we're going to cover ourselves up in jumpers, get into the gym and just do the hard grunt work. So let's make the most of a productive off-season winter period and let's talk all things muscle building and hypertrophy. So to understand hypertrophy, we need to first understand what it actually is. What is hypertrophy? It's a sciencey word, and in a sense it just means muscle building. But the official definition is the enlargement of an organ or tissue from the increase in size of its cells. So hypertrophy can happen in anything. If we train for cardiovascular health, we can actually hypertrophy the muscles of the heart, allowing the heart to get bigger, more efficient, and pump more blood around the body. Many organs in the body can hypertrophy. From what we are talking about here, what most of us are concerned of is hypertrophy of muscle fibers, muscle cells, like growing our biceps, growing our quads, growing our chest. All this stuff is going to make us look better and get stronger. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is what are the mechanisms of hypertrophy. So when we look at this and we break it down, there are three things that you need to understand how to do in your training in order to grow muscle optimally. Those three things are mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. And we're going to break down each one of those for you. So let's start with mechanical tension. It is the single most important factor leading to hypertrophy. So for a while, we generally thought that All of these things contributed equally, and for a time being, muscle damage was considered the most important factor of hypertrophy. We're going to speak about that a little bit for a while, but the old consensus was you broke down tissue, you made it weaker in order to grow back stronger. In reality, that's not exactly what happens, and it's now more about the amount of tension, so sustained tension, let's say, we put on the individual muscle fiber that we're looking to grow. So it's defined as creating enough tension to the muscle to cause a specific adaptation or hypertrophy response. So what does this mean? This means essentially we want to be over time progressively put more and more tension onto a target muscle. And then looking at what's important in the research, it shows that going anywhere between 0 to 5 reps away from failure is what is needed for hypertrophy. And this is almost more important now than actually the amount of load that we lift. Now, we're going to talk progressive over later on and why weight is important, but if there's one thing you take away from this episode in terms of growing muscle, is that you need to go within 0 to 5 reps away from failure. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you have your 15 rep max on the bar and you go for 10 reps. You have now done one significant rep, one useful repetition. The 9 reps prior was prep work. It was getting you ready for that. If you go to 11 reps, you've now done 2 useful reps, and then 3 useful reps if you go to 12. So the closer you get to failure, the more useful reps you have for a good hypertrophy response. When we're looking at the rep ranges for mechanical tension, improvements can be made anywhere between 1 and 50 reps. So when would you go for 1 rep? When would you go for 50? When would you go for somewhere in between? So let's look at this. If we're trying to go 0 to 5 reps away from failure, if we put a 1 rep max on the bar, okay, we have now gone close to failure, so we can tick that box. But in order to progressively overload that each week, or to actually create enough overall volume in our training session to get the response we want long term, we're probably going to destroy our nervous system a little bit by lifting so heavy close to 1 rep max, and we may batter our joints just going under such heavy loads every single time. So that may not be an optimal approach to grow muscle. On the flip side, when we're looking at the 50 repetition ranges, the weight is going to be so light it's going to be hard to create enough of a stimulus for growth. And to take that light weight close to failure where we know we need to be, it's going to take a very long time to do so, making our workouts really, really, really long in duration. How long is it going to take to do 3 sets of 50? So from what I've experienced with clients and what I've seen in research, trying to get someone stronger anywhere between a 6 and 15 rep range overall is going to allow for the best hypertrophy response. So when you're looking at mechanical tension, we're looking at time under significant tension. So this is why we need a weight heavy enough to create a significant amount of tension, and we need to spend a good amount of time there. This is where execution becomes really, really important in our training, because if we then go into a bench press and throw that weight around, while we are putting tension on certain muscle groups, are we actually putting it where we want to? Are we putting it on our chest, or are we now pushing that onto our shoulders, onto our triceps, onto other muscle groups? You're going to create a hypertrophy response if you stick to this close to failure method of training, but is it going where we want it to go? So we want to be looking at a relatively controlled tempo, not massively slow that the weight drops dramatically, but not bouncing using momentum where you're not putting tension. So think of it this way. If I took something, let's say a pencil in my hand, and I dropped it to the floor, how much tension from your muscles is needed to stop that pencil going to the ground? Nothing. That is gravity. But if I hold that pencil and I just slowly bring it down, obviously this is a very, very light item that I'm holding. There is more tension, there is more control. So now I have the control. Now if I want to create response, I now have to lower something heavier than a pencil. So we're going to be looking at progressively heavier loads with significant time under tension. So the next thing that we're going to be looking at is metabolic stress. Metabolic stress is often referred to as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. That's a really sciencey name for essentially a pump. It's when we flood the muscles with blood, with fluids, with nutrients, with waste products that creates a little bit of a hypertrophy response. This creates a cell swelling effect. It's good here if you want to go into these higher repetition ranges and have a crossover in improving your cardiovascular system. So your lungs aren't giving way. It's actually the muscles that are giving way. When you go back into the heavier stuff, you'll now have a better tolerance to these higher repetition ranges, all these points close to failure. It also allows more blood and nutrients to be pushed into the muscle and could be good for building up food to a calorie surplus, what we need to build muscle mass. Now, this isn't as important as mechanical tension, but as we said there, it's good for maybe improving your cardiovascular health if we're going high reps, especially on lower body. It can be good to flood the muscles with nutrients and maybe burn a few extra calories to drive food and carbohydrates up. But also, it can be a very fun way to train. Everyone likes getting a pump in the gym. Everyone likes leaving the gym feeling a little bit bigger. And building muscle is a much slower process than losing body fat. So if we can do something that we enjoy and mentally stimulates us to keep coming back to the gym, then adding in a little bit of pump work at the end of your sessions can be a really useful tool. But just bear in mind that it's not as important as the mechanical tension, which really is the meat and potatoes of our training session. And if we want to maximize metabolic stress within our programming, looking at exercise that challenge the shortened range work really well here. You're going to get more metabolic byproducts taking a leg extension of failure where you can really drive blood into that muscle than we would going on a squat. But if we want to create mechanical tension, adding a squat where you can load the bar more through a greater range of motion might be more optimal in that situation. Shorter rest periods also work well here. If anyone's familiar with the work that Kassem Hansen does at N1, he does what he calls an AMPK method where he does incomplete rest, 8x8s with a short 30 to 45 second rest period. And he does this sometimes when he wants to drive food up and he just wants to drive blood into the muscles, or sometimes when he wants to help athletes carb up for photo shoots. This is a great way to increase some level of metabolic stress. The third driver of hypertrophy is muscle damage. So this is the one we used to think was the biggest driver, and now we realize it probably isn't. And in turn, sometimes it can be counterintuitive. So even though we are still damaging the muscle, there is still an element of we're going to repair stronger. But if we create too much muscle damage, it actually can be a detriment to our program because it affects recovery. Think if you did a really hard leg session on Monday where we did loads of slow eccentrics and we created loads of muscular damage. And then by Thursday, we were still really sore and we could barely lift anything at all. That's going to affect our overall volume for the week. It probably would have been better going a little bit short, a little bit less muscular damage and training with a little bit heavier weight or go a little bit further away from failure and being able to do a second session on the Thursday to drive up overall training volume. So while this is important to add to some degree, we just need to make sure that we're not going so hard in the gym in terms of our muscular damage response that we don't maximize the rest of our training week because we're just too sore to do so. But this is our aim with our programming, we're going to be looking at length and range challenges here. So things like RDLs, things like split squats, sissy squats work really, really well here. Incline bicep curls, things like this where you go into a real stretch position and working there, create more muscle damage, as well as slower eccentrics. So pulling into a really slow eccentric, adding pauses in the length and position can work well to maximize muscular damage. The next thing I want to talk about, now we've understood the drivers of hypertrophy, I want to talk about some common concepts that you need to understand to get the most out of your hypertrophy training. The first one is going to be what we call specificity. Now, specificity, which is really hard to say, is the ability to improve at a specific sport or training goal. Your training must suit that goal. So, for an example, no amount of squats will grow my arms. We've all heard somebody say that squats increase a hormonal environment that allows us to get bigger all over. And while these increases in testosterone may be true, they are very small and don't really make that much of an impact. And our arms will never grow if we don't put our arms to work. So our training needs to be specific for the goal that we are looking to achieve. So breaking this down, we've got two more terms I want to talk about. First off is directed adaptation, and then we're going to talk about training modality compatibility. So directed adaptation is repeated sequential training is needed for the best adaptation. So the great hypertrophy book by Mike Israetel talks about this as as an example, we'll be focusing on learning one language at a time will always trump trying to learn 3 at the same time. So let's say I was going to try and learn Italian on Monday, I was going to try and learn Swahili on Wednesday and Cantonese on Friday. over a 6-month period, I probably wouldn't get that good at any of them because they're all competing. If I just focused on learning Italian, and that's what I did that Monday, Wednesday and Friday, I would get much better response from this. So when we're looking at training, we need to make sure that our training sessions are directed to the goal we're looking to achieve. If we want to have a hypertrophy response, we need to do these things where we're looking at improving mechanical tension. We're creating a progressive overload, which we'll talk about in a second. We're putting tension on that muscle. We're improving our execution. We're not necessarily going out running marathons every day and expecting to get really big muscular. So the next is training modality compatibility. So following on from that, all training modalities should complement the goal. So when we look at the goal we're trying to achieve, if we want to get as big as humanly possible, we want the majority of our training to be focused on bodybuilding style training that maximize hypertrophy if our goal is to get bigger. If we're running marathons all the time, it's going to take away from the nutrients needed to recover from these hypertrophy sessions. So we're not fueling these sessions well enough anymore, and they're going to be almost counterintuitive to each other. But if we did something a little bit more, let's say like powerlifting or Olympic lifting, while these may compete with bodybuilding to a degree, there's a much smaller carryover, and it's much easier to grow muscle and do a powerlifting program than it is to grow muscle and do a marathon training program, because we're not competing for resources. So that is the concept of specificity. We need to make sure our training is purposefully directed in the way we need it to be, trying to do something that isn't our main goal, looking to improve muscle. We see this all the time when people want to build muscle and do things like calisthenics and do things like loads of pull-ups. This might not be the most optimal way to go. While you might build some muscles as a beginner, at some point you're going to need to make your training a little bit more specific. The next thing we're going to talk about is overload. If we want to improve anything, now we understand what we need to do within our sessions, we need to make sure that we're overloading this more over time. So there's two types of overload here. There is acute overload and there's progressive overload. So acute overload is the session. So it's any individual training sessions to meet the threshold capable of creating a specific response. So let's break that down. Acute overload means in that individual training session, we need to make sure that we're creating enough tension on the muscle to create a muscle building response. So this is going to be making sure that the load is heavy enough to create a change in the body. This is going to be making sure that we go within that 0 to 5 reps in reserve situation here. So we need to make sure that we're going close enough to failure with a heavy enough load, and we need to make sure that we're recovering from that session well, not smashing too much volume, finding that right sweet spot. Now, the next thing is progressive overload. This is the buzzword in the industry. We hear this all the time, that you've got to create a progressive overload. And basically what this means is this threshold you meet in the acute overload, in the individual session, needs to get progressively more challenging over time to continue to see progress. So you can have the most perfect acute overload in the session, but if you only train once a month, you're probably not going to get many results. But if you now start doing that session 2, 3, 4 times a week, and each time you're trying to beat your logbook, you're trying to lift more weight or lift more reps, you're going to see over time a progressive overload, that compounding effect of muscle building. So how do we start to look at a progressive overload? How can we overload things? Now, obviously, everyone thinks of load. We want to get stronger. We'll put more weight on the bar. But we cannot get stronger every single week. If we did, we'd be the world's strongest man in absolutely no time at all. So we need to think, what other ways can we continue to make progress, even if week on week we can't add load to the last week? So when you're a beginner, you might be able to add load on the bar every single week. But over time, you're probably going to look at adding the load on the bar every month or every quarter or every 12-week block. So what other methods can we use? We can increase the sets that you're doing for that exercise or for that body part. We can increase the repetitions on that set. We can add more load to the bar. We can increase the range of motion. We can change our tempo. We can improve our execution, which is big. And most of you listen to this is where I would start. Most people have got the idea, they know how to train, they get their article from Men's Health, they see a workout and they go in and do their bench press, the squats, the deadlifts. But they are not maximizing each rep to make sure the target muscle is getting enough of a stimulus. So start here. Slow the reps down. Learn how to initiate from that target muscle and learn how to then take that target muscle and progress the load on that each week. You might initially have to take your weight down 10 to 15% of what you used to and to put your ego aside. But if you now can stimulate your chest on a dumbbell press when before it was all shoulders and triceps, when you start getting stronger, you now know it's the chest that is getting stronger. So moving on now, we're going to talk about the general adaptation syndrome, which is a concept brought together by Hans Selye. And he talks about how we respond to stress during training. So when we create a training stimulus, this creates a stress in the body, which is called an alarm response. We're going to get temporarily weaker in that period of time as we devote resources and break down in response to this stress. We then get something what we call a supercompensation effect, where we actually end up with a greater training. We can do a greater training stimulus. We can get stronger. And this is why the bro splits, where you train one body part once a week, isn't optimal for most people. Most people, we kind of get this supercompensation effect and we don't hit it and we just let that seeper off. It's much better to hit that same muscle group more than once per week, 2-3 times per week, to make sure that when we get this response, we're training again and we're repeating this cycle. But if we train this too many times per week, we could go into overtraining, into exhaustion. We actually start to get weaker. So it's really important to look at your logbook, know, are you recovering from sessions? How long are you sore? How much weight's going in the bar? Are you getting stronger, or are you just getting more beaten up? And the last thing I'm going to talk about on here is when we're looking at progressing our logbook, when we're looking at our weight progressions, don't just get carried away on the amount of load on the bar. So when we're looking at overall training volume means sets times reps times load. And what I see quite often is that people get so caught up in trying to add more weight, they're not paying attention to how many sets they're doing. What's the repetitions from last week? How have they changed? If I did 80 kilos on my bench press for, let's say, 12, 12, 10, and the next week I do 95 kilos, but I do it for 6, 8, and then I can't do any more, I have done considerably less work in that session, even though I've lifted more load. So when you're looking at the progressions in your logbook, keep an eye on all of those factors to make sure you're actually doing progressively more work and creating more overall tension over the session and not just in that set you lifted more in. So now we understand hypertrophy. I want to sort of bring us back on now to how do we fuel this from a nutrition perspective. So step one in terms of nutrition for hypertrophy is finding your surplus. So how do we find your surplus? Now, the best way to do this is probably going for a period of tracking your intake, knowing where you're at and knowing what's happening to your body weight. If even better, it's probably better coming off a dieting phase. Why is it better coming off a dieting phase? And there's a few reasons. The leaner you are, the better you're going to partition nutrients. So carbs are going to go where they need to go. You're going to have a good amount of protein there coming off a dieting phase. You've got some structure in your diet. So you're in a better ability to partition nutrients, which means you're in a good place to build muscle. But it's also good because the leaner you are, you can start to see where your weak points are. I always think when looking at physiques that you're only as big as your smallest body part. If anyone ever looks at a picture of my back makes my triceps look smaller. So my triceps look makes my back look smaller rather than the other way around, where my back makes my triceps look bigger. You notice the smaller muscle groups. And if you're that 15, 20, 25% body fat, you might not be able to see where your weak areas are. Going through a diet and be able to see, okay, if I want to focus specifically on improving my quads or my back or my biceps, we can put a lot more focus on those areas and in turn have a much bigger looking change at the end of it. Because building muscle is a slower process. And if I put 2 kilos of muscle in in one particular small area, it's going to look like you've gained 5 kilos overall because of the overall balance, as opposed to just putting 2 kilos on over your whole physique, and it doesn't actually look that much. So how do we start to find your surplus? So what you're aiming for is to find a position where you're in the smallest surplus needed to see a gradual increase in scale weight and a gradual increase in overall performance. So coming out of a dieting phase, and there's many different ways you can look at dieting phases, and we have talked about this in previous episodes of the podcast, but you want to sort of start increasing your calories from where you were at a dieting phase until you find where you sort of maintain weight. When you are consistently maintaining weight with the calories you're on, look to try and drive performance as much as possible. Now, instead of dictating your changes in calories based off scale weight like you might do in a diet, we're now going to dictate our change in calories based off overall performance. So, when we start to not progress in the gym, or we start to get weaker in the gym, that may be the time then to make an increase in calories. Then we start to see that shift in performance go up again, and we keep changing that as we go. When we're going into hypertrophy phase, understand that diet dictates fat loss. Training dictates muscle building. So when we're doing a diet, the training isn't as important. Our training is there to hold on to as much muscle mass as possible, but the focus is on the nutrition to get us as lean as we want to get. Switching over into a muscle building phase, that our training is going to be the thing that dictates how much results we get, but our nutrition is going to be there to make sure that we're fueling those sessions, recovering those from those sessions, and improving on those sessions week by week. A rough place to start in terms of maintenance calories is anywhere between 16 to 18 calories per pound of body weight. So find out where that is, maybe run that for a couple of weeks, see where you're at. If you need to adjust, you can adjust up. Now, quickly going into the finding your maintenance calories, understand that the first place when you're coming out of a dieting phase where you start to maintain weight might not be actually your true maintenance calories. So let's say your maintenance calories is 2,500 calories. You go through a diet and there's going to be a natural decline in testosterone and thyroid. That's inevitable. Obviously, you try and manage it so it's minimized, but there is going to be some. You're also going to find that thermic effect of food is going to be lower. So we're not burning as many calories from eating our food because we're not eating as much food. There's not as much to burn through. Our NEAT, which is our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the amount we move, fidget, move around, also goes down in a diet. So that's going to be less. And all these things are actually going to bring our maintenance calories down. So let's say our maintenance calories was 2,500, it now might be 2,100. So let's say you finish your diet on 1,700 calories, you may go up to 2,100 and find you're maintaining weight there. After a few months, after you start to eat more food, there's a higher thermic effect. As you start to increase NEAT and move a little bit more, as you start to train a little harder, we might find that our actual maintenance calories then goes up. So what this might mean is that you might find somewhere you maintain weight and then you start to drop weight. This is maybe a good time then to look at pushing those calories up until you find that sweet spot of a surplus. The next thing you want to be looking at is setting your macros for building muscle. And people tend to overcomplicate this. So let's first look at protein. The thing with protein is that more doesn't mean more muscle. And in fact, it can stay similar to the targets you had during your fat loss targets. Initial baseline for protein, probably anywhere between 1.8 to 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight is a good place to start with protein intake. And adding more protein does not mean, as I said earlier, that you're going to have more muscle mass. If anything, that could be taking things away from carbohydrates. We just want enough to make sure that we've got amino acids there and repairing and recovering, but we don't need any more of that. There's no additional benefit in a building phase to do that. And if anything, really, you could probably drive protein higher in a dieting phase because that's going to help satiety and keep you full and appetite control, which is counterintuitive when you want to push calories up and you don't want to be quite as full. Also, you haven't got enough calories in a dieting phase to repair and rebuild as much as you do when you're in a caloric surplus. So having more protein will help you maintain your muscle mass. But you don't need as much protein in a building phase because you've got enough calories to make sure you don't lose any muscle. There's no reason for the body to get rid of muscle when you've got a surplus of calories. So keeping them similar to where you are in a dieting phase is probably about the right place to go, and maybe bringing them even a little bit slightly down to maximize your appetite if you're struggling to get in the food. The next thing we're going to talk about is fats, and they're needed for hormonal health and vitamin and mineral absorption, but have no real significant advantage other than that in a building phase. So they are 9 calories per gram, and I think a base layer of this is when you're looking at fat targets is what you need to make your diet enjoyable, that you can do for the long term, and then you don't necessarily need any more. So that brings us on to the final macronutrient that we're going to talk about, and that is carbohydrates. And this is the most important one, in my opinion, when it comes to looking at building muscle, because carbohydrates are our fuel for training. So they're going to help drive training performance up, which is exactly what we're looking to do when we build muscle. This is the most important thing we need to do. The other thing it does is it calms the central nervous system. And this is really good in the muscle building phase because we don't grow in the gym. We grow outside the gym from our rest and recovery. So while we want our training to be a stress, anytime outside of our training session, we kind of want to be in a relaxed state that's going to optimize recovery. So having in carbohydrates that allow us to calm that central nervous system down outside the gym could be a really good thing to do. And this really is just going to be the remainder of your calories after you decide what protein and fat is set. And it's going to be the thing that you probably going to increase the most because of the performance benefits. If you start hitting a muscle building plateau, the increase in calories is going to come from carbohydrates, or should do in my personal opinion. So what else do we need to consider when we're talking about building muscle in terms of nutrition? The first one is our peri-workout nutrition. So what peri-workout means is just the nutrition we're going to have around our training sessions. And obviously we're going to separate that into pre-workout meal and post-workout meal. Why is this the most important time? Because the main aim of our nutrition is to drive training performance up. So we can bookend our workouts with some good fuel and good nutrition. We're going to maximize our training and in turn maybe maximize our muscle building response. So the pre-session meal is really, really important for performance improvements. A good place to start is 1 gram of carbohydrates per kilo of body weight, but just having a meal sometime before you work that has some form of protein and some form of fairly moderate to fast acting carbs is a good place to start. How long before this workout should you have it? It really is individual, but I would say anywhere between 45 and 90 minutes out from the gym. And it's going to take a little bit of trial and error. I tend to find that 45 minutes works really well for me because I digest my food pretty quickly. So I go into the gym ready to go, bit of fuel, and I'm not training hungry, which I hate training hungry. But for other people that try 45 minutes, might find that they feel a bit sick, they feel like they have some undigested food. So they might want to go a little bit further away. Some people go all the way to 90 minutes. I know if I do this, I start to feel hungry. I start to feel like I'm lagging in energy. So play around with it. Find out where the sweet spot is for you. Now, in terms of the post-workout meal, this meal is now important to optimize recovery and to drive what we call a parasympathetic state. This is our relaxed state. If we see a fight and flight or rest and digest, this is us trying to drive a rest and digest state. This is where we grow. So we create a stress, then we calm ourselves down to recover from that stress. Now, that being said, this is where we talked about anabolic windows. That we say that a lot of like men's health articles, things like this will say that you've got to have a meal straight after you train because it's when our muscles are going to take in the most nutrients. While that is technically true, when you actually look at research, this anabolic window is much longer than people think. So as long as you have something, I would say anywhere between 60 minutes to 2 hours after your workout, you're probably going to do pretty well. And it doesn't really matter that much. If you want to wait a few hours, as long as overall calories are where they need to be for the day, it doesn't really matter if you have that post-workout meal the second you drop your last dumbbell. So the thing to think about with how long you have this post-workout meal, just think about when the last protein feeding time was. So if you're training fasted in the morning, you might want to have something relatively soon afterwards, right? Because you're probably going to be in a more state of breakdown because you haven't got any food coming in. If you train in the middle of the day and you've had a meal an hour and a half before, doesn't really matter. You can wait till dinner if that's the case. And one thing I like to do is optimizing this meal for adherence for me and my clients. So a lot of the time that people come out of a dieting phase a little bit worried about eating things that they deem like an off-diet food plan, but it's important for our mental health and longevity to training and food that we can enjoy some foods that are a little bit more guilty pleasures. So this could be a great time post-workout, adding in something like whey protein and cereal or something like that, or squares bars, what I quite like, but something that feels a little bit of a treat, because then you want to go in and train hard. Sometimes when I know I've got my treat after my training session, I want to go in and really smash the gym because I want to earn it. And it just means that I'm going to train that a little bit harder. I'm going to enjoy my post-workout meal, and it creates a little bit of structure around my meals and around my training. That means it's easier to stay consistent. So last few top tips. The focus is on fueling sessions and optimizing recovery. If we can't push intensity in the gym, we can't improve execution, we can't improve hypertrophy response, then there's no real point in pushing calories. We have to also be mindful of digestive issues. As we push calories up, there's more chance that digestive issues could be the problem. And that could affect nutrient absorption and affect how much we get a hypertrophy response. So the big thing to remember coming out of this is it doesn't always have to be 100% clean. Sometimes coming out of dieting phase, we try and build muscle totally off clean foods, and it's just sometimes not practical. So adding faster digesting stuff, cereals, rice flakes, intra-workout carbohydrates, sweets even sometimes, can be a really good thing just to be able to ramp the calories up with not affecting our digestion. Really maximize what things you digest well to get the most out of your nutrition. And you want to put the body in a best place to digest food. So calm state after a workout. Can we do breath work after workout to bring our central nervous system down? Could we make sure that we're eating without distraction? We're making sure we chew our food, and we're just making sure that we're as relaxed as possible outside those sessions. So now we've understood nutrition and what hypertrophy is, let's actually get into the nuts and bolts of how we plan our hypertrophy cycle. So what considerations do you need to consider? The first thing is understanding, do you really want to build muscle? After working with guys now for the last 11 years, is that a lot of people don't want to build muscle as much as they think they do. They see that that's the thing you do after a dieting phase. I finish a dieting phase, I build muscle. I look at men's health and go, I want to build muscle. But they get lean for the first time and they realize they look bigger, leaner, and they just don't want to lose their abs. They just want to be able to have abs and be able to go out for a beer and a pizza at times. And that's not a bad goal. So don't push into a goal that you think you want rather than what you actually want. And if you want to just try and slowly get stronger, put muscle on a little bit slower, that's absolutely fine. And that's better than trying to push for something you don't want, and as you start to get a little bit softer, freaking out mentally a little bit. So the focus with the hypertrophy cycle, as I said earlier, should now be moving away from scale weight and on to shift to improving your performance. Because building muscle takes a lot longer, and if you're focused on the scale weight or if you're focusing on how you look, this can become a bit of a mental headfuck. So I always look at building muscle. It's like comparing putting money into a savings account and putting money into an index fund. Fat loss is like putting money into your savings account. You can see every month you put money in there, you see that number going up. Your bank account gets more and more and more, and you're feeling every week, every month, you're getting a little bit richer. It's quite exciting. You're getting that mental reinforcement that you're doing something good as your bank account looks more healthy. This is like a fat loss effect. When you start to see the muscles that you're working on, you can see fat coming off every month, and then as you get leaner, every other week, and then every week, you start to see new veins and new muscles, and you're getting that constant reinforcement. But building muscle is slower, and building muscle often means you're going to have to get a little bit softer, and you're almost hiding your hard work as you're doing it. Like when you put money into an index fund, let's say the FTSE 250, you're taking money out of your bank account. You see the number in your bank account going down, and that could be quite of a struggle mentally to get over. But it's tipping away in the background, making a compounding effect. And over time, if you took your money out of your investment account in a month, you wouldn't gain that much money. But if you took the money out of the index fund in 5 years, you have a little bit of a lump sum. This is like building muscle. You're doing the work, you're hiding the work as you're getting a little bit softer, but when you diet again in 2 years, it's like cashing out your money out of the index fund and seeing all the hard work show itself, and your bank account goes up, or you see the improvements in your physique from the previous diet. So shifting to a performance mindset is more important here, so we can just keep ourselves consistent and keep our head above water when we're actually not seeing that the fruits of our labor every single week. As we said before, we want to make sure that the leaner you are, the better nutrient partitioning we have, and the longer a dieting cycle can last. As we get a little bit softer, insulin sensitivity tends to decrease, which means that our nutrient partitioning goes down. We don't drive nutrients where we want them to go. So let's say, for sake of argument, that 20% body fat is the point where our muscle building efforts become a little bit less effective. Now, this is just a number I've plucked out of thin air. This is totally individual. Everyone's going to be a little bit different of how their body responds, depending on their stress, the recovery, their life, their genetics, all this stuff. But let's say it's 20%. If we start our building phase at 16%, we've only got a 4% body fat window before we have to sort of pull back and go into a mini diet, which means we can't give our building phase the real amount of time it deserves to kind of really see some progress. But if we started, let's say, 8 to 10%, we now have a 12 to 10-12% body fat window, we can have a much longer building phase. We can spend a lot longer building up our performance in the gym, and we can put a lot more muscle in before we have to think about mini dieting. So when we're looking at a training cycle length, you're looking anywhere between 12 to 16 weeks, but it can go longer. If it's not broke, don't fix it. If you're getting stronger and you're enjoying your sessions, keep that going. But we're going to be looking probably anywhere from between a 12 to 16 week cycle. Assess where your physique is, assess where you are from a body fat percentage. Are you softer than you'd like to be and want to go to mini diet, or do you want to push on? So when we're looking at rates of muscle growth, this is something that people are very unsure of, and they don't know where the genetic ceiling is. My big advice when it comes to genetic ceiling is you're never going to know you hit it. So don't get caught in this trap of thinking, well, there's no point, or maybe I've hit my genetic window. Always keep pushing, because it just keeps you in training fun. If you've all seen that guy in the gym that trains like shit, but builds loads of muscle. Why? Because he trains harder. And if we can maximize our training, and everything I talk about here is all dependent on you going in and training hard and getting close to failure. And if you prefer to do really high reps, 6, 12, 25 rep workouts, or you prefer to do 8 times 3 and like putting a load on the bar, then be my guest. Even if it's not the most quote unquote optimal on paper, you need to be consistent and enjoy your training for the long term. Otherwise, all this stuff I talk about is worthless. But essentially, in the fat loss phase, you're trying to lose 0.5% to 1% per week of your body weight. In a muscle building phase, it's almost the reverse, but per month. So you're looking like 0.5% of your body weight per month, 1% of your body weight per month. And like a dieting phase, where you have that big initial drop in body weight and then it stabilizes to that 0.5 to 1%. In a building phase, you get an initial increase because you eat more food and glycogen and all that sort of stuff. But then it slows down to that very slow, gradual increase per month that we want to see. And this is going to have, like dieting, there's going to be fluctuation. There's going to be days we spike up and days where we drop, but this is what we're looking at over an average. Now, how quickly do you want to gain muscle? Now, this is obviously individual depending on what you want to do, and here are general my expectations. If you're wanting what I call the recommended muscle gain, where you're looking at gaining sort of around about 1% per month, you're going to get a moderate rate of muscle gain and strength. You're going to have a small to moderate fat gain, right? An inevitable fat gain. You will try and minimize it as much as possible. You're going to have to gain some fat to push into a surplus enough to build muscle. And if you're coming out of a dieting phase, it does mean you can get an initial bump in calories to find where that like slightly lower maintenance is, and then we can start to increase calories from that point. So it allows you to kind of get a break from dieting a little bit and then slowly work towards pushing on to a muscle building phase. And your length of the building phase then can be fairly moderate in length. You can get a good amount of time to really push forward. Now, if you say to me, but Simon, I want to grow muscle quicker. Now, when you're looking at aggressive rates of muscle gain, understand there's only so much muscle we can gain at any one time. So going into a dirty bulk and just saying, well, if I can eat twice as many calories, I'll gain twice as much muscle, it doesn't really work that way. So you might get faster initial strength gains because we just got a lot of fuel to fuel our sessions. But in terms of muscle, we're not going to gain any more by going more aggressive in terms of calories. And you're also going to get a faster rate of fat gain. And this is not what a lot of people want. But does that mean that it's not a benefit of sometimes going more aggressive in a muscle building phase? No, because the advantage of this is you can go straight to maintenance calories out of the dieting phase. If you don't care about losing your abs a little bit and you're kind of burnt out by the dieting process, going straight to maintenance calories allows everything from a health perspective to ramp up really quickly, quicker than you probably would on the moderate gain, and you can then just push on. But it does mean that more mini diets are needed if you want to control your fat gain, which could interrupt the muscle building process to a degree. Now, on the other end of that, when we're looking at sort of like a slow to moderate gain in muscle mass, this is for the people that, want to build muscle, but not really. They just want to stay lean and be able to enjoy their training, get a little bit stronger, and be able to enjoy a beer and take the shirt off the beach and not feel embarrassed. This is totally fine. But you've got to understand that the rates of strength gains and the rates of muscle gain are going to be slower in return for accepting that your fat gains are going to be more minimal. And the other thing you've got to bear in mind with this is that the building calories come out of a diet phase is going to be slower. So you're going to have to feel almost like you're dieting a little bit longer. So if you're enjoying your routine, you found a good routine, you're enjoying dieting, great. We can then start pushing on a little bit, gradually working away towards maintenance calories and find that sweet spot where you're barely gaining any fat and it's really, really slow process. And the advantage is it does allow for a longer building phase. So Moving on, one of the most prolific researchers in the field of hypertrophy these days is a guy called Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization. And I'm just going to go through some of the a glossary of terms that he often uses that I think is really important for you to understand. So when you hear someone talk about MV, this is minimum volume. This is the minimum amount of volume you need to maintain your muscle mass for a specific body part. Minimum effective volume, or MEV, refers to the minimum amount of volume you need per muscle group to have a growth effect, to build muscle. Maximum adaptive volume is the maximum you can sort of adapt from. And then every now and again, you want to push to something called MRV, which is your maximum recoverable volume. And this is something you don't want to spend all of your time there, but this is almost like that we spoke about that super compensation effect. You want to push that little bit, just go a little bit longer from what we can recover from, really push the boat out, and then we kind of push back to allow ourselves to recover. The other things we're going to talk about is going to be range of motion, or ROM. And we're going to talk about the term systemic. So systemic means the impact of training on the entire system. Rather than a local response, if I take my chest to failure, that's a local fatigue. A systemic fatigue is what amount of stress we're placing on the entire body from our training. RAR is what we call reps in reserve, and we spoke about this earlier on with the 0 to 5 reps in reserve is what we need to build muscle. And technical failure is where we stop our sets when form breaks down, as opposed to muscular failure, where the muscle cannot even move the weight anymore. So let's look at planning your hypertrophy block. The first thing we're going to talk about is reps in reserve. And we spoke about earlier that you need 0 to 5 reps in reserve to really get a good, sufficient muscle building response. But the question I want to ask you is, do you really know what 1 to 5 reps in reserve actually is? Most people, when I work with people in person and I say, how many reps do you feel you have in the tank? They'll say 1 or 2 because they know that's what I want to hear. But when I look at the rep speed, the reps doesn't slow down. If we're getting to a true 1 to 2 reps in reserve, the last few reps are going to be a grind. They're going to be painfully slow. And this means that a lot of people just don't really know how hard they can work and what a true 1 rep in reserve is. So what I want you to do at the start of each block of your training, or if you're new to training, I want you to do this in the first few weeks, is something called a challenge set. So if you've got on your program written down 3 times 8 to 10, I want you to do what you think is 2 to 3 reps in reserve, set 1, what you think is 1 rep in reserve, set 2, and set 3, I want you to go to at very least technical failure, if not complete failure. Just no rep count, just go until you can't do any more. And let's say you do 15 kilos for 10 reps and you think that's 1 rep in reserve. On the last set, you do 20. You now know that wasn't a 1 rep in reserve, and you know that next week you need to increase the load lifted. This is fine for beginners who may not know how to get the most out of every single set and not know how to really push themselves. So we're not going to be really taxing our whole systemic recovery too much because we're not getting as much from each individual set. But in this time, it teaches you to train harder. And over the first 3-4 weeks of our program, you start to begin to know what truly 1 rep in reserve is. And we know what we need to aim for in each and every set. When we're looking at compound lifts, so our bigger lifts, squats, deadlifts, bench press, things like this, we're going to be looking at leaving more reps in reserve here and going to more technical failure. It's not safe going to a no rep in reserve, absolute muscular failure on a set of back squats. But if you want to set a leg extension or a set of hack squat, it's going to be much safer to do that. In machine lifts and isolation lifts, we can go close to muscular failure and really push the boat out. So this is where we're going to use our challenge sets. And as we said earlier, just a reminder, 0 to 5 reps in reserve, true 0 to 5 reps in reserve is needed to be enough of a stimulus for growth. The next thing we're going to look at now, we've got a reps in reserve. We know how to take each individual set to where it needs to go. We're going to be now talking about volume. So volume, overall training volume, is sets times reps times load. So this is basically an equation for the amount of total work we are doing in a session. So progressing sets over the course of a block is a predictable way to increase volume over a block. Why is increasing sets rather than increasing load or reps? Because while we probably will increase reps and load over the course of the training cycle, you can't predictably do that. So one day you might come in and everything feels really light and you can push big numbers. And some weeks you just have a lack of sleep or work's kicked your ass and everything feels really, really heavy. So we can't rely on these ebbs and flows and swings in life to be pushing load every single week. But if we can, and we always are looking to beat the load, we're going to improve load. But we want to do this in a situation where we can actually make sure over the course of the block, we guarantee we are pushing ourselves closer to where we need to be. So we can progress sets over the course of the weeks, makes it much easier to predictably get where we need to in the training cycle. When we're looking at the total body systemic maximum recoverable volume, you're looking at anywhere between 15 to 25 sets per session. And this is going to be lower for advanced trainees and more for beginners. You might think that's counterintuitive. You might think like beginners surely can do less volume because they're not as efficient, and more advanced guys can do more. But remember, the more advanced person can get more out of each individual set, so they have to do less total sets because each set is more taxing. So if you're a really advanced trainer and you can really push each set hard, you're probably going to be looking at anywhere between that closer to that 15 to 20 sets, and then that 20 to 25 sets per session, maybe more for your beginners, and over time we want to bring that level down. So total systemic minimum volume is going to be around about 10 sets. So that's the minimum amount of sets you're probably going to be looking at doing in a session, unless you're really advanced and you can train balls to the wall on every single set. So next thing we're going to talk about ways of progressing volume over a block. So over the block, look to work up from your minimum effective volume for that muscle group to the maximum adaptive volume, or every now and again, pushing even further up to the MRV. You want to focus mainly on each block on the target muscles for that training cycle and put other muscles closer to the minimum effective volume, closer to maintenance mode. So you can't try and grow everything all the time. You're just going to push so much stress on the body. You're going to push that systemic load so much because you're trying to train everything at once. When you're looking at a training cycle, go, okay, here's my training cycle. I want to focus for the next 4 weeks or next 6 weeks or next 10 weeks on chest. So I want to start to push chest a little bit higher in terms of overall volume, but maybe I'll put back and legs or something like that a little bit lower, and maybe we can switch them around in a further block. So you want to find the sweet spot with volume where you can consistently overload and recover from. So let's say you start at minimum effective volume, and let's say you're going to be working up to 25 sets and you're starting at 14 sets. Maybe week 1, you do 14 sets over the course of the week for chest, and then you go 15, 16, 17, and you find that point maybe at 18, 19, and you go, I can still get stronger here, but I'm struggling to recover. Then maybe you back off a little bit and you hold that for the rest of the training block, and then ride that wave until you can't now add load onto the bar. As we said before, this is going to be more sets probably for the less efficient people, but it's going to be less sets for the more advanced people who can get more out of each individual set. And when it comes to reps in reserve, maybe starting when you found out what a true 1 rep in reserve is, start at 3 to 4 reps in reserve in the first 2 weeks of the block, and then maybe work in the last couple of weeks to pushing really hard to 0 to 1 rep in reserve for the last week or 2 of the training cycle. Now let's look at periodization, and in particular, how we like to program muscle building training cycles with our clients. So we work often on a 3-phase cycle. So phase 1 is what we call high intensity tension. So we're going to work up from our minimum effective volume to our MAV, our maximum adaptive volume. And that's where we're going to be looking at maybe less sets per muscle group, looking at improving execution, and just trying to find that sweet spot that they can recover from. Now, this could be the only cycle you do. You could repeat this cycle, just changing target areas, and this could be a great way to grow. But every now and again, we like to try and push to that maximum recoverable volume and then back off into a deload. So what we call phase 2 is our metabolite phase. This is where we're going to push a little bit more metabolic stress. We're going to push volume up to our MRV, and it's a little bit of the Arnold Schwarzenegger, if he dies, he dies. This is a hard block, and it's only for people that you know can recover from it. People will have to have good sleep. The health markers have got to be in a good space because we are pushing beyond what they're currently capable of. And because of this, this is probably a short 2 to 3, maximum 4 week cycle. And then we're going to go into phase 3, which is a pure strength block. Now, the reason why we go into a pure strength block here, even though we said that it's probably not as optimal, strength training is a lower inflammation stimulus on the body, which means we can sort of allow us, we've pushed the body hard, we've created all the stress, and then we back off and recover with the strength phase. And in that time, we are now getting used to holding heavier loads. So if our limit, let's say on our bench press was 90 kilos, and now we go to, let's say, 6 sets of 4, and we get used to holding 95 kilos in there, we learn to stabilize that weight, we get used to what that weight feels like. So then when we go back into a high intensity tension phase, we now can push maybe 90 kilos for an extra 3-4 reps, or we can maybe do 91 for sets of 6 to 10. So it just allows us to get used to pushing heavier loads. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is going to be our hypertrophy split. So this is a split, there's many splits you could do for hypertrophy. Whatever you enjoy is probably going to be the best advice I have, but generally we want to aim to train our main muscles 2 to 3 times per week. Think of it as turning this light switch on to muscle building. If you hit the muscle group once per week, you turn it on once. If you hit it 3-4 times a week, you turn it on twice, 3 times per week. So what I find works, I like upper-lower split works well for beginners, upper-lower rest, upper-lower. But the one I think works really well and is really adaptable to if you have to train more days a week or less days a week, whether it's you just like to train 3 days a week or you like to train 5, or maybe one day you train 5 days a week and the odd week work gets really busy and you feel you can't get into the gym. You still want to make sure that you get the most out of your training in those 3 sessions. It's a really adaptable program. So what we're going to do is on day 1, we're going to do a front body session. What do I mean by front body? We're going to train chest, delts, we're going to train quads, so the front of our legs. On day 2, we're going to train back body session. So glutes, so our bum, glutes, hamstrings, back, triceps, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to be targeting the front body on day 1, the back body on day 2, and we'll train the entire body in those 2 days. So that means even if you can only get to the gym twice per week, you've managed to hit every muscle group on the body, at least to its minimum level of volume. Then we're going to take a rest day, and that's when this can be a really adaptable program. So after that rest day, I want you to pick the target areas that you want to push in that phase, and I want you to add that as a target area. So for sake of argument, if you did 3 days a week, you go front body, back body, rest, and let's say you wanted to focus on chest, you do a push session of chest and triceps. Or maybe you want to do focus on building up your legs, so you go front body, back body, rest, legs. If you want to train 4 days a week, you can then focus on 2 target areas. So you go front body, back body, push legs, front body, back body, pull, push. And we can actually get a little bit more volume on the target areas and back off on some other ones. If you want to train 5 days a week and you've maximized your recovery and you know you can do it, because not everyone should or can train 5 days a week, but if you can do front body, back body, rest, push, pull, legs. And then you can really motor on trying to get enough volume as you can in those sessions. Now, we can go into another podcast talking about what we're going to do in those individual sessions and how to put them together. But hopefully this episode has given you enough of an idea how to think about training for muscle growth and how to put your session together. If you have any further questions, let us know. Find me on @KingsleyDutton, drop me a message, and I'll be more than happy to help you out.